Poetry is an instrument of figuring things out distinctively its own. And so it is akin to our other human instruments of thought, be they Hubble telescopes, which just had its 30th birthday, congratulations, Hubble, or a system of logic, or a language, or mathematical equations. And there's no other, all the arts, one could say the same of, we just happen to be speaking about poetry. They are ways of taking in, comprehending, navigating, knowing our lives at a more intense saturation and distillation than other forms of thought would quite permit. It is thinking with the whole body.
This time on the Plutopia podcast, poet Jane Hirshfield joins John Scoop and Maggie Duvall in the virtual studio. Jane shares her poetry and provides a window into her creative process, Zen Buddhism, and much more.
Welcome to the Plutopia News Network. The latest episode of our podcast today includes myself, John Lepkowski, Scoop Sweeney, and Maggie Duvall is joining us as well. And our special guest today is Jane Hirshfield. She's an award-winning poet and essayist. She's written 9 books of poetry. And her latest book, Ledger, I have just finished reading, and it sort of expanded my consciousness and also my subconsciousness. Jane is going to open with a poem called I Want to Be Surprised.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And I chose this poem as an opening spot because we are taping this, of course, well into the coronavirus pandemic, and most of us staying at home, although some of us starting not to in various places. And even though it's been going on for a couple of months now, I still find myself deeply surprised by the whole thing, surprised by even having known that, of course, we were at risk for a pandemic. Anyone who pays attention has known that was going to be one of the abiding possibilities. But the thing about surprise is you can know something might come, but when it does come and you see the actual shape and the actual flavor of it, you are still astonished. And the magnitude of this event and how it is affecting everybody's lives and how it is going to continue to affect everybody's lives in ways we can't begin to fathom yet. That just remains for me a great source of astonishment. So the poem is, I Wanted to Be Surprised. To such a request, the world is obliging. In just the past week, a rotund porcupine who seemed equally startled by me. The man who swallowed a tiny microphone to record the sounds of his body, not considering beforehand how he might remove it. A cabbage and mustard sandwich on marbled bread. How easily the large spiders were caught with a clear plastic cup surprised even them. I don't know why I was surprised every time love started or ended, or why each time a new fossil, Earth-like planet, or war, or that no one kept being there when the doorknob had clearly. What should not have been so surprising, my error after error, recognized when appearing on the faces of others. What did not surprise enough, my daily expectation that anything would continue, and then that so much did continue when so much did not. Small rivulets still flowing downhill when it wasn't raining. A sister's birthday. Also the stubborn, courteous persistence that even today please means please. Good morning is still understood as good morning. And that when I wake up, The window's distant mountain remains a mountain. The borrowed city around me is still a city and standing. Its alleys and markets, offices of dentist, drugstore, liquor store, Chevron. Its library that charges, a happy surprise, no fine for overdue books. Borges, Baldwin, Szymborska, Morrison, Cavafy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
I really have to ask, who is the man who swallowed a microphone?
So he was a composer, and I'm really sorry, I'm not going to remember his name. We overlapped at the Artists Colony McDowell in New Hampshire, and he actually played us the piece of music that event resulted in, and it is absolutely true. He said it was really hard to get the microphone out, and he hadn't thought about it. So the spiders are New Hampshire spiders. The porcupine is a New Hampshire porcupine. The sandwich was a McDowell sandwich. I draw a lot in my work on what is around me. I draw from my life. I'm not at all an autobiographical poet. It would be very hard to reassemble the facts of my life from my poems. But every single poem comes from experience, whether it's lived experience or the experience we all have through reading books, music, culture, history, science. And poems are always, no matter how much some of them might seem to be looking at outward things, they're always written into some inner question. Sometimes you don't know what the question is until you write the poem and you find the question that the poem is busy trying to answer. But you never write a poem about something you already understand or know completely. You write poems about things you don't know the answer to, you find unfathomable, unaccountable. And poems don't give you permanent answers. It's not like math problems, but they give you responses. And those responses for a moment become what Robert Frost called a momentary stay against confusion.
When you're writing a poem, do you feel like actively engaged in the process, or do you have a sense that you're kind of channeling it and that it's coming, like emerging from somewhere beyond thinking?
Yeah, it's much closer to the second. I rarely know in advance even what the next word is going to be. And, channeling is a little strong. The way I tend to think about it is listening. I'm listening with both my inner and outer ears, with my sense of music, with my sense of my senses. Poetry is deeply embodied thought, but it's not willful thought for me. It is very much a listening to an inner voice that is going to say something that I couldn't possibly predict. Maybe it's close to dreaming, except with more collaboration from the conscious mind.
Lucid writing.
Yeah.
Well, you've described poetry as a clarification and magnification of being. Can you expand on that? What is poetry really for?
Well, poetry is an instrument of figuring things out distinctively its own. And so it is akin to our other human instruments of thought, be they Hubble telescopes, which just had its 30th birthday. Congratulations, Hubble. Or a system of logic, or a language, or mathematical equations. And there's no other, all the arts one could say the same of, we just happen to be speaking about poetry. They are ways of taking in, comprehending, navigating, knowing our lives at a more intense saturation and distillation than other forms of thought would quite permit. It is thinking with the whole body. You've got your tongue, you've got your pulses, you've got your memory of what it feels like for your feet to step one foot, the next foot on a barefoot path. And it lets you, in a way, bring... neuroscience says that poetry is one of the only arts in which both hemispheres of the brain are quite equally engaged, because it's right brain imaginative thinking and left brain use of language. So I think all of our rational achievements as human beings are terribly important, and they bring us a great deal of creaturely comfort and a great deal of order in what might otherwise be chaos. But I don't think we could measure any human achievement without also weighing it on the scale of the emotions and the scale of our thinking. And poems, thinking and feeling. And poems are very good for doing that. They allow you to feel, with that magnification and clarification of being, what our lives mean to us. And without meaning, how could we judge anything else?
Just hearing you speak, it feels very synesthetic and multidimensional and not flat, and like a dialogue with the rest of the world, in conversation with the world. It's really beautiful, the way you're expressing, the way you work.
Thank you. And I think a poem is also a dialogue with the rest of the world. And that sense of, I'm really glad you said the rest of the world, because that's also very important, at least to me, in poetry. You know, there's lots of kinds of poets, and a different poet, you'd be having a different conversation. But for me, one of the other things that allows poems to magnify and clarify our existence is that they are in such profound interconnection with all of existence. You know, you say the word rock in a poem, and it's not some inert thing. It is the rock of the outer world, the rock made of whatever process, igneous or sedimentary, led to its being there. But it is at the same time the rock of the psyche. It is what rockness means to us human beings. And so nothing is not alive in a poem, and nothing is not part of one continuous fabric of existence. If it's in a poem, you recognize this. You're working with this. It becomes the paint palette that you're holding in your hand. But I think life is also like that. And one of the things poems allow us to do is feel how much life is like that, that a chair isn't just something you sit on. You know, the whole history of chairness is in a chair, the whole history of whoever made it, whatever style it's in. And so, you know, every single particular image that a poem chooses to pick up, it's one thread of the entire quilt of time and knowledge and language and music and history and labor and imagination and dream.
After reading Ledger, I came away feeling good. It made me feel a lot better than I had when I started. But have you ever written an angry poem?
By the way, I'm very heartened to hear that it made you feel good, because I do think it's a book filled with despair. I mean, the largest through line in Ledger is the subject of the crisis of the biosphere and the crisis of social justice and our compact with one another. And, you know, one of the poems in it, this isn't an angry poem, but I think it is the darkest thing I've ever written, is a poem called Chazal for the End of Time. And it truly is imagining, you know, what if we fail? What if all biology is actually brought to ruin by our human choices? And the poem left me in such a state of despair that I had to write another one to apologize for having written that one. Anger, so it's interesting. It's a great question. There are angry poems. I have a theory myself that every good poem is a fabric with two sides. And if the poem is a successful angry poem, there is also going to be an underthread of tenderness running through it, or it will merely be a bad poem. It will just be another voice shouting at you, and that's not poetry. Similarly, if a poem seems, too beautiful and too positive, it will just be saccharine and awful, and your mouth will reject it because it's just too sugary. What poems are good for is combining the multiple elements that allow us to think things through more fully. If you're thinking singly, you're not thinking well. Life is complicated. Human beings are complicated. Nothing is simple. Even the sentence, "nothing is simple," probably isn't simple. So, there is probably some anger under many of the poems in this book, but it's not the dominant element. So there's an opening poem, a sort of pre-poem, "Let Them Not Say." And that poem, certainly one of the generative energies behind it is that I am appalled by what we are doing to the earth. But its tone of speaking is not angry. It's, "Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard." And so the anger is just one alloy in the instrument the poem is trying to make and the music it is trying to make.
When I said I was
themselves are never completely, they're never simple. There's like love and fear and love, right?
Yes, exactly.
Sorry, Scoop, I interrupted.
well, I'm just saying that when I said your work made me feel good, it kind of complicated because I actually enjoyed some of the darker pieces because it made me feel like I wasn't alone in observing that way.
Thank you.
It's just a way of saying, well, thank you. I've had similar thoughts and I kind of felt guilty about it.
Yes. And that also is one of the things I think are among the primary tasks of poetry is exactly what you just named, which is to help each of us realize, whatever we're feeling, whatever circumstance we're in, we're not alone. Somebody else lived that, saw that, felt that, survived it, witnessed it, and then was somehow able to shape it into words that could carry it and hold it and bring it forward. And that reminder just of accompaniment, that can be a life rope for many of us in our darkest moments. Isolation is terrifying. But if you are alone in the blackest pitch dark of your night, and then you read Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, Carrion Comfort, which I'm sorry I can't quote to you by heart, you realize, oh yes, this is a human experience. And that feeling of what I feel is human and known, and others have been here before and left me their witness of that moment. You're not alone. And solidarity is one of the great recalibrating keels of the psyche.
I wonder how well you see what you write reflected in the people who read it. I mean, do you get feedback that gives you an idea what they're thinking as they read your poems?
It varies a great deal. One of the most, I'm speaking a little out of school here, but as a teacher and a person who leads poetry workshops, one of the scariest things is you're sitting there at a table with 12 people, everybody's looking at the same poem, and the interpretations can be so wildly varying that it really makes you wonder how we ever understand one another at all, because, most of the time we're not spelling it out. Most of the time there's a sort of general consensual agreement, and somebody isn't saying, now from those 3 words, what I think is being intended. And when you start looking in that fine-grained way, you start finding out that people are really varied. Now, I think being not a postmodern poet, but just a human one, just a normal human poet, I think it is my job to try to set down words that will allow people to hear the same music of existence that I am hearing when I wrote it. I'm trying to leave you a score that will put you in at least the same quadrant of the forest as I think I'm in. But sometimes the answer comes back, oh yes, you feel absolutely, completely understood. So, for example, there was just an article written in Tablet magazine that I know John, before we started talking formally, said he just read. And the man who wrote that clearly was hearing the poems that I was writing. I felt so understood reading his piece. And he wasn't just reflecting them back. He was having his own experience and his own thoughts from having met those poems, which is exactly what you want. A poem isn't a static endpoint. It is part of ongoing lives. But then other times I have certainly known my poems to be what I found stunningly, read in ways that I would never have fathomed they could have been read. And sometimes I'd look at that and say, that's just a misreading. But one very startling time, I looked at the poem and I thought, there's nothing in the poem that says you couldn't understand it that way. It just isn't the least bit what I meant.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've written things where I got feedback that included an interpretation that I hadn't really thought of or been conscious of, but I wondered if it wasn't what I really was writing,
Oh, yes. Well, there's a name for that in literary criticism. It's called the authorial fallacy. And the best example of that, the best known example of that is, Robert Frost saying, I wasn't ever writing about death. I'm just a country Vermont farmer describing the natural world. Whereas everybody knows Robert Frost was writing about death. So yeah, there's definitely times when there are things inherent in your poem that you didn't realize were. There was one poem I wrote, its title, and again, I don't memorize my own poems either, sorry. Its title was Against Certainty. And I wrote that poem thinking of the political world and thinking of the world where people who are sure they are right do a tremendous amount of damage because they are so convinced of the rightness of their idea that the ends justify the means. And I'm terrified of certainty. So I wrote this poem, but the poem is all in the image of, a cat hiding in a hedge, things like that. Well, there was a great American poet, Stanley Kunitz, who died at 100. And at the very end of his life, he wasn't writing anymore, but his relationship to poetry was he would recite one poem a week with the young woman who was his assistant in the garden and his general helper, Janine Lentine. And he would record the poem. And she sent me an email and said, Stanley is reciting your poem Against Certainty. Would you like me to send you the audio? And I said, yes, of course. And between her taping it and my receiving it, he had died. It turned out that the day he recited that poem was the last day of his full consciousness. And when I heard him say it, I understood instantly that to him it was a poem about entering the gates of death, that was the certainty it was against. It was saying, I am going into the great unknown. And I heard the poem and I thought, he said so much greater a poem than I wrote. And there's nothing wrong with the poem that I wrote. It's a good poem about what I thought it was about. But he found in it another poem which just shook me with his completely different interpretation of the same words on the same page.
So you have practice of Zen Buddhism, and I just wonder to what extent that's reflected in your poetry or in your approach to making poetry.
So it's an interesting and complicated question in that I began sitting meditation informally in 10th grade, and then formally when I was 21 years old, I ended up I drove down a road to look and see what was then the only Zen monastery in America because I was curious about it. And I ended up staying in formal Zen training for 8 years. So I spent my 20s in Zen practice, not writing poetry for the most part. And then I went back to the regular lay world, which is one of the paths of Zen. And I still sit. I'm still a member of, the same lineage of Zen as I spent my 20s intensely following the schedule of. But for my poems, they have less overt, explicit references to things from Zen than many people who've never crossed their legs and sat on a cushion. And that is a kind of deliberate choice on my part, in that I don't want my poems put in a cupboard with a label on it and interpreted according to, somebody's ideas, since most of our ideas about Zen are all wrong because Zen doesn't live in ideas to begin with. I am happy when people who have practiced and read my books or hear me read, they recognize the Zen in the poems. They recognize certain ways of feeling about the world, which come out of this particular worldview, to be fond of transience rather than to hate transience. One of the things Zen practice tries to do is to take us human beings who love to cling to the idea of permanence and get you to agree to impermanence, which is, after all, the truth of all things. Everything is changing at every moment. And so, yes, those things are in my poems. And yes, my years of formal training and my continuing practice are very much the diamond at the center of my life. But I don't want it to be the label. I don't want it to be the lens through which they're looked at, because I think, as I've always thought, if there's anything at all of value in Zen practice, it should be findable by any person in any tradition, in any culture, at any time. These are just things that are there to be seen. Concentration is there to be entered. Perishability is there to be observed. And you can find, for example, in 16th century poems from Mesoamerica that were written down by the Spanish missionaries, there's a number of poems talking about flowers and transience and impermanence. And they sound just like Japanese poems that were written from a Buddhist tradition. But obviously, Nahuatl poetry from the 16th century, they knew nothing of Zen. They just knew the world. And if you look at the world, you see what happens to flowers, and you treasure them anyhow. One of the poems that I have, I'm moving on to a slight swerve here, but one of the poems which has really kept me company during this time of shelter in place, while reading the newspapers and seeing the television news and reading the online articles, as holding the flavor for those of us who are not frontline workers and for those of us who are not ourselves ill or have a loved one ill. There's this odd dual vision of my very peaceful garden, my life which is quiet and surrounded by beauty, and then the knowledge of what is going on for others, not at all far away. And a haiku by a poet named Isa has been much in my mind. And what Isa wrote was, "We walk on the roof of hell gathering blossoms." We walk on the roof of hell gathering blossoms. And I used to this goes back to what we were saying about poems having multiple ways of being understood. Most of my life, I've thought that poem was kind of bitter, that it was saying, here we are gathering blossoms and suffering is everywhere around us and we're ignoring it. And for some reason, during this particular time, I've come to a different relationship with it, which is what I hear in that poem is, yes, there are hell realms, and yes, there are blossoms, and both are real.
Mm-hmm.
Jane, do you have any poetry that you've written over the years that you were proud of, you finished, it was good, and you decided, for whatever reason, to not share it with the rest of the world? I know I have personal writings that I thought were great, and after reading, I went, no, I can't share this for various personal reasons. Have you had that experience? I know other writers I know have the same thing. They have that little file of things not ready for prime time.
I have a few poems I have held back because they were too revelatory of something I wasn't willing to share, but it's very few. I think I tend not to write those poems in the first place. As I said earlier, I'm not an autobiographical writer. Mm-hmm. I sometimes describe it as my poems aren't portraits, they're X-rays. And so, there are very few poems that I've thought were, not that it wasn't ready for prime time. There are lots of poems that had something good in them, but they weren't good enough. They never came into complete shape. And so many poems don't get published. But the poems that I feel are actually, good poems, publishable poems, but I've held back because they said something I didn't feel like saying in public, only a very small handful.
Yeah, that was my experience. I wrote a blog post some years back dealing with the death of my sister and the circumstances. And I was proud of it, but I read it and thought, do I really want my sister's children and grandchildren to hear me ranting about the circumstances that led to her demise? And I felt that was a good choice to make, to leave it for someone else later on to discover, but I wasn't going to share it.
I think I would agree with the choice. And I know, there are many, many, many writers for whom this is far more frequent, especially people who work in memoir or the personal essay, and even fiction writers where something is thinly disguised. And I do lean, people can argue both sides, but I lean towards the protection of the living feelings, especially within the family. But, lots of times I, like everyone else, will be thrilled that somebody didn't do that. And a great work of art is in the world because somebody didn't hold back for half a second. So it's a very difficult question to navigate, and I'm glad I personally don't have to navigate it often.
I took a return to a deep dive back to the books of David Abram and the sensual world, the becoming animal and all that. And I've been thinking a lot about oral storytelling and poetry. And as we were talking about earlier in our conversation about the dialogue between the world, I love what you said about the chair and everything that goes into making it, all the elements become that chair. And it's like a swirl in my head right now during the time of COVID. What are your thoughts on the power of poetry and storytelling to maybe help us out of this abyss we find ourselves in at the moment?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting that Virginia Woolf actually wrote about this in a sentence or two into The Lighthouse. bad times are good for poetry. You know, we find our work needed when times are at their direst and their darkest. And I certainly, you know, I don't know about the Austin newspaper, but the San Francisco newspaper has been running a great deal of poetry in recent weeks. And a poem of my own was actually the first one, because I wrote it the very first day of shelter in place, when the sudden silence descended upon the world. And you could just hear that we were in a changed state of existence. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a poem, and 4 hours later, I got an email from the arts and culture editor of the San Francisco Chronicle saying, you know, do you have anything, could you write something for our readers? And I said, well, I never write on commission, but I wrote something this morning. Would you like to see it? And he put it up, you know, a couple of days later, and it circulated wildly. The title sort of holds the circumstance, the title, Today When I Could Do Nothing.
Oh.
And it's about that first day when, you know, there you are, you're at home, and the combination of helplessness, knowing that, you know, all you can do to help is stay home and do nothing. And then, as had actually happened and precipitated the poem, an ant had been crawling around on my computer and then onto my window seat, and I put it outside. So, you know, the first lines of the poem are, Today when I could do nothing, I saved an ant.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. And so, but that I would write that poem, that 4 hours later it would be asked for, and, you know, 3 days later it would go up online and start being read by hundreds and thousands of people. I have no idea how many people have read that poem by now. It's already in, you know, 3 forthcoming anthologies and projects.
Oh, wow.
You know, so poems, by offering a vessel of, again, to go back to that Frost phrase, you know, a momentary stay against confusion, by putting into words everyone's experience, mm-hmm. they help us. It helped me to write it. It helps other people to read it. It helps me to know that other people find it useful, that it answers the confusion, the uncertainty, the fear, the solitude, the helplessness. And that's the thing, you know, as long as a work of art can be made, we have some agency. There's never a moment, the last line of the poem is, you know, I did this, you know, today when I could do nothing beyond keeping distant from my own kind, I did this. And that is the agency of art. When you can't change your outward circumstance, you can change your inhabitants and your relationship to any circumstance you find yourself in, right up until the moment of dying. You can do this.
That's beautiful, and I hope we Scoop and John, I hope we have a link to that in the Chronicle on the Plutopia site, and I'm definitely going to share that with a couple of my groups that I'm in that have, you know, the first thing that comes up is just the sort of self-flagellation for not getting things done. And I'm like, we're not in that time, y'all. We're in a different space where it's like the car is in neutral right now. You know, there's nowhere to go. There's just here. Yeah.
And that itself is both a kind of opportunity, you know, for the lucky amongst us. Mm-hmm. That pause gives you a chance to think and feel more deeply, to sit, do nothing, and see and hear, and just recognize that to exist is enough. We don't have to prove our existence. There are times when we do, and there are times when we don't need to, and they are not less worthy. You know, to be alive and to breathe is such a great privilege. To see the sun glinting off any old green leaf. What luck that is.
And hearing all the bugs and birds you don't normally hear, for instance.
That's right. Yeah. Enjoying themselves a little bit more because we're enjoying ourselves a little bit less.
Exactly.
When I looked at the Plutopia sort of mission statement before doing this, one of the things that I saw was a phrase I really liked, and I might be misappropriating it a little bit, but I believe there's an idea on the website about configurable lives, configurable worlds, configurable lives.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I love that phrase because that is exactly what poems are doing. They give you a tool for reconfiguring your own interior life and your relationship to the exterior world. And it made me think a little bit of, there's this quatrain by Yeats that is just sort of put on a page in one of his books. It doesn't even have a title. And what he said was, so it's about revising poems, and we haven't talked about that. You don't just write a poem, you revise it, you reshape it, you configure it. And so poems give you a tool, as he describes, for working with your life. And what he said was, my friends who say I do it wrong whenever I remake my song do not know what is at stake. It is myself that I remake.
Wow.
Isn't that fantastic?
Mm-hmm.
It is. Yes, you have exactly the right interpretation of our I think about configuration. Originally, we had an installation that we did at a maker fair, and it was about the DIY house of the future, the fact that in the future, homes would be built so that they would be highly configurable and people could just sort of alter their environment because the materials were such that, and also the electronics and the media and smart home ideas and all that gave you an opportunity to really configure your environment. And what you've added to that, and what I think is even more important, is that we can all configure ourselves internally. We can configure our heads, we can configure our thinking and our emotional responses. And that the sophistication to be able to do that sort of reshaping, I guess,
yes,
of yourself is something that I think is very well served by using words in ways that are unexpected, I guess.
Exactly so. Which is part of, when I opened with, I wanted to be surprised. So I have a book of essays called, 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World. And my favorite chapter in that book is the one on surprise, because I do think that the unexpected and the malleability, that's the great joy of being alive, is that, things are not, how boring would it be if everything were predictable and knowable and fixed? So human beings long for safety. We know this, but we also long for risk. We really do. The exploring impulse. Evolution puts that in you because you need it. And so, I myself don't much care for roller coasters, but people in general seem to like that kind of thing. And it is exactly the opportunity to experience lack of control, unpredictable, you're in a situation that in any normal world, plummeting, down with gravity and faster than gravity, it would be terrifying. We like being a little scared.
We're persistently in the act of creation, even if we don't realize it.
That's right. And life is never under control, and we're never safe for half a second. I love your installation description. I wish I could have seen it. I've often sort of thought to myself, architecture is fate. That the house you live in and the way the rooms are, and especially if you live with another person, it just makes a huge difference to every other part of your life. Just, I live in a house with windows on every side.
Mm-hmm.
That changes my life. It changes my days. And in poetry also, there's, to do a sort of Jungian interpretation of image, houses in poetry are almost always figures for the self. If a house appears in a poem, the person is also talking about their life.
This is making me think about how we bought a bed recently, and it's a really nice bed. And we spent a lot
Congratulations.
of money on it. Yeah, and my, Marcia was not sure she wanted to spend that kind of money on a bed. And I said, we spend a third of our life in the bed.
Mm-hmm.
We're there, a third of every day. So we certainly should feel okay about spending some money on it.
Yeah. And the nightly happiness. Just every night you get in and you go, I like this experience. This moment is a good moment.
And it's not just getting in the bed. It's like the presence of the bed in the room. I mean, we had a significant change in the sense of our room that we spend so much time in, because we got the bedroom set actually, and it was a complete transformation of the room. So moving the furniture around is really, something that people should consider doing.
Sounds like you practice a little feng shui.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can move the furniture around in your head too.
So yes. So the famous poem of Rilke's, "You must change your life," the last line of his archaic Torso of Apollo, you must change your life. And, there's such joy in that. And every time you have a new thought, or you write a new poem, or you read a new poem, or you buy a new bedroom set, you're changing your life.
Mm-hmm. When I moved from in '95, when I moved from Berkeley to New Mexico, to Suque, New Mexico, I ended up in an Adobe. It had been renovated by an artist. She's known as the artist in Adobe, Myrtle Stedman, and there was just something amazing. It changed my life just being in this home with eccentric curves and angles, and that was emerging from the earth, the big thick walls. It was so wonderful. Just it amped up my art. It amped up my life. I ended up getting married and having a baby there and all sorts of things.
Well, if he were still alive, you'd have the architect Chris Alexander on as a guest, who talks about exactly why New Mexico architecture and other vernacular architectures make us feel better in every moment. I love the pattern language. It was one of those cult books of all of our youth, and I still think about it all the time.
It would be a great thing to talk about. Actually, I wonder if I'm sure there's people who have expertise in thinking about pattern language.
Oh, sure. And he left disciples in architecture. I used to think that one could do a similar analysis with poems. It's like, what is the poetic equivalent of light on two sides of every room? And I knew it could be done, and I figured I didn't actually have the temperament to do it. And then it turned out somebody did a PhD thesis exactly on that. Sort of taking all of his principles of, windows with deep reveals and why we like them so much, or why we like multi-paned windows. If we do, not everyone does, but I certainly do. And, you can translate his principles of why the world seems larger rather than smaller if you look at it through a window with multiple panes. And you can translate that into principles of poetry, and I'm sure into principles of music. These are deep human truths, and deep human truths will have their equivalent in whatever material it is you're talking about. You could probably do it in terms of narrative plot. So another of the essays in the 10 Windows books is about windows. And just a moment when a poem stops thinking about whatever it is thinking about and literally looks somewhere else, sees something else for a line. And what a powerful expansion that is, and how it changes the rest of the poem. That for that one moment, you have let in another view of the world, another way of being in the world, other people, a truck outside a window during a music lesson. The world is different when you remember those trucks exist. And I think that is one of the jobs of any work of art, is to allow you to feel the world differently and to allow you some glimpse of augmentation, amplification.
We're near the end of our time together, and you and I had discussed how you might read a poem at the end of our discussion, and we were thinking about today, Another Universe.
I would be glad to do that.
That would be great.
So my neighbors had 3 very tall old pine trees on their property, which one of them especially began to tilt. And other neighbors moved in and were told below them and were told, you won't get house insurance until that tree goes. And so this is a poem which came out of a tree, both ordinary and extraordinary, being taken down. Today, Another Universe. The arborist has determined senescence, beetles, canker, quickened by drought, but in any case not prunable, not treatable, not to be propped. And so, the branch from which the sharp-shinned hawks and their mate cries, the trunk where the ant, the red squirrel's 80-foot playground, the bark, cambium, pine sap, cluster of needles, the Japanese patterns, the ink net, the dapple uncertain fish. Today, for some, a universe will vanish. First noisily, then just another silence. The silence of after, once the theater has emptied. Of bewilderment after the glacier, the species, the star. Something else in the scale of quickening things will replace it. This whole of light in the light, the puzzled birds swerving around it.
Jane, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the conversation.
Jane's latest book of poetry, Ledger, is available on Amazon, or better yet, at your local bookstore. You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.